worship sheets, and you'll find on the back our scripture lesson for today, which is found in Luke, the 24th chapter. So we enter into the season of Easter in which we read about these post-Easter appearances of Jesus. And we know that to begin our lesson for today, those guys that were on that road to Emmaus, they are coming back from Emmaus to Jerusalem. They saw the risen Christ, and so they meet with the disciples, and it says, "Then the two told what had happened on the way, and how Jesus was recognized by them when he broke the bread. And while they were still talking about this, Jesus himself, he stood among them, and he said to them, 'Peace be with you.' And they were startled and frightened, thinking that they saw a ghost. And he said to them, 'Why are you troubled? And why do doubts rise in your minds? Look at my hands and my feet. It is I myself. Touch me and see. A ghost does not have flesh and bones, as you see I have.' And when he had said this, he showed them his hands and his feet. And while they still did not believe it because of joy and amazement, he asked them, 'Do you have anything here to eat?' And they gave him a piece of broiled fish, and he took it, and he ate it in their presence. And he said to them, 'This is what I told you while I was still with you. Everything must be fulfilled that is written about me in the law of Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms.' And then he opened their minds so that they could understand the scriptures. And he told them, 'This is what is written. The Messiah will suffer and rise from the dead on the third day. And repentance for the forgiveness of sins will be preached in his name to all nations, beginning at Jerusalem. You are my witnesses of these things.'" Once again this morning, you'll find an insert in your bulletins if you'd like to follow along with the points of our message this morning. You know, pretty much everybody in this room today, I would imagine, is either a grandparent or a grandchild. And if so, then it's always interesting for me to sort of discover what your particular clan chooses as a name for one's grandparents. And of course, some choose more traditional designations like grandma and grandpa. But if you have multiple sets of grandparents and then great-grandparents, it sort of gets a little tricky, doesn't it, to name everybody grandma and grandpa. So in our family, we've chosen some sort of non-traditional names for grandparents. For instance, my wife is known to our two granddaughters as Gam Gam. And I'm known as Peepaw. Well, such is the case with an acquaintance, a friend of mine who happens to live down south, and he has a grandma. They call her Ganny, and Ganny lives in this small town down in South Carolina. And when my friend goes to visit Ganny, the aroma of all kinds of good things, come wafting out of her kitchen, out through the screen porch, out into the yard. Southern dishes, like collard greens and ham hocks and cornbread. Hopefully cornbread, says my friend, because apparently the one thing that Ganny has trouble baking is biscuits. And that's a sin for a grandma down south. It seems that Ganny isn't a big believer in things like baking powder. So on those days that she decides to go baking biscuits, she'll open the door of her old pot-bellied stove. I had a great-grandma who had a pot-bellied stove. So when she bakes and when she's done, she proceeds to open up that pot-bellied stove, and out comes a tray of burnt hockey pucks. Friends, when you think about that, my buddy says that when you take one of old Grandma Ganny's biscuits and you drop it on the floor, that literally it can wake the dead. He says, my family has a nickname for Ganny's biscuits. We call them resurrection biscuits. Because when you think about it, something that you drop that's loud, is something that can literally wake the dead. I don't think it was Ganny's resurrection biscuits that 2,000 years ago caused Jesus to rise from the dead. No, we know it was the power of the living God. And yet, as we talked about last week, we talked about the fact that it was more than his disciples could begin to process. The disciples, they thought that their journey with the Master, that it was over. I mean, hadn't he been crucified? Hadn't they seen his body laid there in that borrowed grave? But then on Sunday, 3 days after his burial, they begin to hear these rumors that maybe Jesus was alive. And so that morning, we know that some of the women connected with Jesus, they took some spices and they went to the tomb. And when they got there, strangely, the stone was rolled away from the entrance and the body was not there. And when they went in to look, they pondered this mystery, and suddenly 2 men in shining white garments stood there with them. And the frightened women, they bowed down their faces to the ground. And then the men said to them, "Why do you seek the living among the dead? Jesus, he is not here. He has risen. Remember how he told you while he was still with you in Galilee that the Son of Man must be delivered over into the hands of sinners and then be crucified, and on the 3rd day he must rise again." And although they vaguely remembered those words, it was still nothing short of unbelievable. So when they came back from the tomb, the women, they proceeded to tell the disciples what they had seen and what they had heard, at which Luke, he reports to us. But the disciples did not believe the women because their words seemed to them like nonsense. So was it a hoax? I mean, they certainly were not immune to superstition. Yeah, perhaps it was some kind of a ghost. But then suddenly, Jesus, his resurrection body, it appeared there among them, and the disciples are startled and they are frightened, upon which the risen Jesus says to them, "Why are you troubled? And why do you doubt? Look at my hands. Look at my feet. It is I myself. Touch me and see. A ghost does not have flesh and bones as you see that I have." Folks, the response of Jesus' disciples, it could almost be a sermon in itself, because Luke tells us that they still did not believe because of joy and amazement. In other words, it was simply too wonderful to be true that their Master was alive and that he was there amongst them. It was an event that had never happened in human history. I mean, no wonder they had difficulty believing. In fact, a lot of people still have trouble believing today. Many of us, we desperately want to believe, and yet something holds us back. Look at my hands and my feet, Jesus said. It is I myself. So why do you suppose that some of us have trouble believing that Jesus arose from the grave? Folks, how about this morning that we take some time and we talk about 3 common stumbling stones that we often find as believers along the path of faith. First off, do you suppose that some of us have trouble believing that if there really is an eternal, all-powerful God, that this omnipotent, omniscient being would really love us so much that he would send his own Son to suffer and then to die and then to be resurrected on our behalf? Yeah. Some of us are more comfortable with an impersonal God, an uncaused cause, the prime mover, the ground of being, a source of life and power, but not a personal God. The idea of a God with nail prints in his hands and feet, because of his great love for us, some of us perhaps we're not ready for that. You know, I like how author and pastor Max Lucado describes this God's love in his book, In the Eye of the Storm. God the Creator carries on a conversation with an angel there in the garden as he is about to create Adam and Eve. This is what Lucado says. He placed one scoop of clay upon another until a form lay lifeless on the ground. All were silent as the Creator reached into himself. And he removed something yet unseen, a seed, the seed of choice. And creation stood in silence and gazed upon the lifeless form. And the angel spoke, "But what if he chooses not to love?" The Creator finished. "Come, I will show you." And unbound by today, God and the angel walked into the realm of tomorrow. There, see the fruit of the seed of choice, both the sweet and the bitter? And the angel gasped at what he saw. Spontaneous love, voluntary devotion, chosen tenderness. Never had he seen anything like these. He absorbed the kindness. He marveled at the warmth. Heaven has never seen such beauty, my Lord. Truly, this is your greatest creation. Ah, but you've only seen the sweet. Now witness the bitter. And a stench enveloped the pair. And the angel turned in horror and proclaimed, "What is it?" The Creator spoke only one word: selfishness. And the angel stood speechless as they passed through centuries of repugnance. Never had he seen such filth, rotten hearts, ruptured promises, forgotten loyalties, children of the creation wandering blindly in lonely labyrinths of their own making. "This is the result of choice?" the angel asked. "Yes." "They will forget you?" "Yes." "They will reject you?" "Yes." "They will never come back?" "Some will. Most will not." "What will it take to make them listen?" And the Creator walked on in time, further and further into the future, until he stood by a tree that would be fashioned into a cradle. And even then he could smell the hay that would surround them. And with another step into the future, he paused before another tree. It stood alone, a stubborn ruler of a bald hill, and soon it would be cut, and soon it would be trimmed, and soon it would be mounted on the stony brow of another hill, and soon he would be hung on it. He felt the wood rub against a back that he did not yet wear. "Will you go down there?" the angel asked. "I will." "Is there no other way?" "There is not." Wouldn't it be easier not to plant the seed? Wouldn't it be easier to not give the choice? It would, the Creator spoke. But to remove the choice is to remove the love. And he looked around the hill, and he foresaw a scene. 3 figures hung on 3 crosses, arms spread, heads fallen. They moan with the wind. All heaven stood to fight. All nature rose to rescue. All eternity poised to protect. But the Creator gave no command. "It must be done," he said, and withdrew. And the angel spoke again. It would be less painful. And the Creator interrupted slowly. "But it wouldn't be love." Yeah. It wouldn't be love, would it? What a magnificent portrayal of all of the heart of God. Because how outrageous are the claims of the gospel that the divine Creator of all that lives and breathes and has its being would come down to earth and suffer and die so that none of us can say that our God does not love us. And you know, no religion in the ancient world made this claim, that human beings are loved by God. No one went around writing songs that sang, Zeus loves me, this I know, for the Iliad tells me so. Nobody wrote songs like that. That would have been absurd. God was to be feared and obeyed and approached with trembling and awe. So to think that God could be more loving than one's own loving parents was beyond their comprehension. And yet that's the outrageous claim of the Christian faith. In fact, in trying to deal with the meaning of the cross on which Christ died, the early church, they came to understand that those nail prints in the hands and the feet of their master should have been in our hands and in our feet. We should have paid the price for our sin. And this eternal God, He so loved the world that He sent His own Son to bear the burden that was brought about by the iniquity of us all. So folks, let me ask you, can you deal with that? Can you believe that God really cares about us that much? You know, back several years ago, I met with a man just a few days before he would die. And so I asked him if he was afraid of dying. And to my surprise, he said, "Fear? No, I'm not fearful because of my faith." And then he said, Pastor, I look back over my life, all the mistakes I've made, all the times I've turned away and gone my own way. And time again, God found a way to get to me by looking for me when I wasn't even looking for Him. So if He did that, I don't think that my dying is something that is going to stop His love for me. Now, there was a man who knew how much that God loved him. Friend, can you believe that God loves you that much? That's one stumbling block as to why some people have difficulty believing in the resurrection. They have trouble believing that God really loves them. But secondly, I think that there are others who have difficulty believing that there really is a life after death. A lot of folks, they have a hard time believing in a resurrection because it just seems too unbelievable. And yet think about it. Just a couple hundred years ago, if you had told your great-great-great-great-grandfather that you could fly from New York City to Los Angeles in, say, under 5 hours on this vehicle that weighed hundreds of thousands of pounds with over 300 people on board, flying at 5 miles high in the sky, what would he have done? He would have laughed in your face. There is no way he could have ever believed such a thing because such a thing had never, ever been done before. And if you told him that people would walk on the moon, or this machine called a computer could do billions of math equations in literally milliseconds, do you think that he would have believed you? Sure. It's so easy to believe. We believe it because we take it for granted, having witnessed it and experienced it for ourselves. But you know what? Someday, when we are resurrected with Jesus, we will see just how foolish we were not to have believed. Because as I told you on Easter morning, from this book, by one-time atheist Lee Strobel, a book called A Case for Easter, a book that we put in each family's hands. Lee Strobel in this book so clearly reveals how those first believers believed, how ironclad was the reliability of their witness, because they really did see the risen Christ. And when the evidence was weighed out, Strobel had no choice but to believe. And I know it sounds too unscientific, too seemingly unprovable to believe that there really is a world beyond our own, this other existence in which that which dies here on earth is resurrected to new life there. And yet, such a conviction, doesn't it lie at the very heart of the Christian faith? So if you struggle this morning with the concept of an afterlife, I hope and pray that in this Easter season, you will at least entertain the possibility that this, the greatest news that the world has ever known, is worth investigating for yourself, much as Lee Strobel investigated it. You know, sometimes I think you and I we're sort of like these twin baby brothers who carried on this conversation in their mother's womb. And at first, as their awareness grew together, they laughed for joy, saying, "Isn't it great that we were conceived? Isn't it great just to be alive?" And then over time, the twins began to explore their new world, and they found their mother's cord, which gave them life. And so they sang for joy, saying, "How great is our mother's love for us, that she shares her own life with us." Well, the weeks began to stretch into months, and the twins noticed how much they were changing. "What does it mean?" asked the one. "It means that our stay in this world is drawing to an end," said the other. But I don't want to go," said the first. "I want to stay right here." "We have no choice," said the second. But maybe there is life after birth. But how can there be such a thing, said the first. "After all, we shed our life cord then, and how is life possible without it? Besides, we have seen evidence that others were here before us, and none of them have returned to tell us that there is life after birth. So no, this has to be the end." And so the first twin, he fell into this deep depression, saying, "If conception ends in birth, then what is the purpose of life in the womb? It's just meaningless. In fact, maybe there is no mother after all." "But there has to be," protested the second. "Or how else did we get here in the first place? And how do we remain alive?" "Have you ever seen our mother?" replied the first. Maybe she only lives in our minds. Maybe we just made her up because the idea made us feel good." And so their last days in the womb were filled with deep questioning and fear, until finally the moment of birth arrived. And when the twins had passed from their world into the next, they opened their eyes and they cried for joy. For what they saw, it exceeded their wildest imagination. And friends, what a wonderful metaphor for what awaits us when we pass from this life into the next. And I know that some of us, we have difficulty accepting that God really loves us that much, or that there really is an afterlife in which we will be resurrected beyond the grave, and yet even more, perhaps for some of us, our biggest stumbling block is that many of us don't want to deal with the implications of the first two truths. Yeah, what does it really mean? What does it really mean if there is a God who loves us without reservation. And what does it mean for our lives if life really does go on beyond the grave? I like what renowned theologian Wolfhart Pannenberg once said. He said, the evidence for Jesus' resurrection, it's so strong that nobody would question it except for two things. First of all, it's very unusual. But secondly, if you believe it happened, then you have to change the way you live. Did you hear that? If you believe it happened, then you have to change the way you live. You know, that happened in the lives of those first disciples. Their lives were literally transformed in a matter of days after their encounter with the risen Christ. From frightened and uncertain followers, marked by doubt and envy and selfishness, they became apostles of great courage and self-giving. In fact, Acts chapter 17 says that they literally turned the world upside down. Their witness was so undeniably powerful that they added to their numbers daily those who were being saved. Sure, if you believe it happened, then you have to change the way that you live. Folks, as we wrap up this morning, I want to read a little part of a letter that I got from our missionaries to Africa, Scott and Cindy Pendleton. They say, Dear Pastor Jeff, Scott and I are so grateful for your faithful partnership with us. Pictured here are former Muslim terrorists who are now Christians. They are being trained to use the Jesus film to lead others to Christ. Several of these trained men traveled to a militant area to meet with a powerful chief who oversaw many tribal groups, nearly all militants. And they offered to show the Jesus film, and the chief promptly put them in jail. And the prison guards asked to see the film because it was in their language. And the men set up their pocket-sized projector, and they started the film. And the chief heard what was going on, and he came to watch. And midway through the film, he ordered the men to stop. He left, but later returned with his family. And soon the guards, the chief and his family, were all watching the Jesus film in their language. And when it was over, the chief asked to see it again. And at the end of the second showing, the chief stood, and again he left the prison, and this time he returned with a tribal sword. And the men assumed that they would be killed. And instead, the chief explained that the sword had been passed down from chief to chief for nearly 1,000 years. And he handed the sword to the men, and he said, I am no longer a tribal chief. I am handing over my life, my ways, and my sword to you. I am going to follow Jesus. And through his influence, the men went on to show Jesus in the villages throughout this militant area, and we were told that many house churches were planted. Thank you for partnering with us to take the gospel to this amazing place. What a privilege it is to know that together we played a part in making this story reality. Can I hear an amen? Amen? If you believe it happened, then you have to change the way that you live. How about you? What difference has knowing the risen Christ made in your life? Has it had a dramatic impact on your goals? If indeed there is an eternity, then in light of that eternity, some of our goals must seem rather short-sighted in comparison. Those of us who have seen the hands and the feet of the risen Christ and live our lives in light of that eternity never run out of a purpose for our lives. Yeah, God really does love us that much. Life really does go on beyond the grave. So what is your response to these two great truths? And I guess the final stumbling stone is, has it changed your life to know that Jesus is alive? And if not, then perhaps now is the time to open your heart to the transforming power of God's love and the glorious news of the Easter story. Would you pray with me? Father God, do you really love us that much that you would send your own Son, your own self, to live and suffer and die and to be resurrected? Is there really an afterlife, a heaven in which we can place our faith that is secured for us? Where is there proof? And if we believe such things, what does that mean? Does it mean that our life has to change? Father, help our unbelief. Help us to believe and so become Easter people. Our lives resurrected from the grave while we yet live, so that we, like that chief, may surrender our swords, that we might turn and follow you, so that others might know that you live.